Money never sleeps, pal.
Hey there, I'm Pete Townsend, and this is Money Never Sleeps. We look inside the minds of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by Pat FinTech, the training partner that demystifies fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. On the show this week, we've got Steve Ritter.
Hi, I'm Steve Ritter, CTO of Mitek.
Sharing his story on fueling his passion for problem solving with technologies like machine learning, biometrics, identity, security, cloud, and mobile. How he thinks about creating safe digital environments to build trust, achieving the careful balance of friction and convenience in consumer fintech, the reality of defending against deepfakes, and digital infrastructure priming the pump of inclusiveness, all right here on Money Never Sleeps. Steve, listen, I've had a quick look back at your LinkedIn profile like I do for pretty much everybody, and saw that you've got quite an interesting backstory there. I want to get into that a little bit, but can you share that backstory with us and maybe give us the number one lesson that you learned in the first 5 years of your career that has stuck with you through this day? Yeah?
Sure, no problem. I'm going to go quite a ways back, though, but I'll make it brief. So I was born and raised in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and I began coding when I was 13 years old. And based on that, I think I had right around 40 years of experience writing software and just being immersed in technology. Since then, and after getting out of university, I've been part of 5 startups, and I've also spent time in larger companies like McAfee, Intel, WebSense, and even a brief stint recently at Apple. And while I've got a lot of experience across many different verticals, the majority of my time really has been in cybersecurity. And more recently, I've been with Mitek for the last 5 years. And during that time, my full focused exclusively on identity. From a technology perspective, my primary focus is machine learning and enterprise architecture. And you asked what's my number one lesson I learned from the first 5 years. And I spent a little bit of time thinking about that one. I'd say that, first and foremost, and this is important, I think, for technology people to really understand, is understand what the market needs, right? And once you understand what the market needs, do whatever it takes to deliver the right solution to solve that problem, regardless of whether or not the solution is really hard or really easy. Just deliver the right solution for the right problem.
Oh, I know what you mean. And you got me thinking about mistakes I've made in the past where I didn't do that. Thinking about the first 20 years of your career, right? And taking a look back at all of that, that gave you tons of rich, deep problem-solving experiences across different technologies. Like you said, your main thing now is identity. There's so many needs for solutions enabled by machine learning, by identity, security, cloud, mobile. That must have made you quite passionate about all this stuff, right? And how do you keep fueling that passion and make it something that is just incredibly important to you?
Yeah, well, as I said, I've been focused on technology from a very early age. And I think I grew up in an environment where technology was just all around me in the Bay Area. And I think, I'm just continually inspired by the amount of good that technology has and can provide in our world. I'm also very cognizant of some of the potential downsides if it's not implemented and deployed correctly. But with technology having such a big impact on our lives and technology itself changing literally on a daily basis, sometimes throughout the day, it seems like I'm always seeing a new paper pop up on archive or something that's just changing the world of machine learning. So for me, it's not hard to stay passionate about this because it's so interesting and it's so influential.
I hear you. And it's like, once you're deep into this, it's kind of like you see something, whether it be a white paper, another new company you hadn't heard of, like you said, a new technology, someone doing something. I think you mentioned when we first talked, you mentioned Lex Friedman at MIT, right? And just finding out what these people are thinking about just keeps you going down that rabbit hole time and time again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really neat aspect of today's technology world with how big a part of our lives social media is. You have this emergence of this whole sector of people that focus on communicating science and technology out to people. And that's kind of the category I put Lex Friedman in. He's a fantastic engineer and machine learning researcher in his own right, but he also has a great talent for communicating technology issues in a way that people can understand. And he's also been able to get some amazing guests on his podcast. So if you haven't listened to Lex yet, I definitely recommend giving his podcast a listen.
Absolutely. No, I will tee that up. I had a quick look at him the other day just to familiarize myself with him. And that he looks like a pretty interesting dude. So I'm going to check him out. Speaking about those technology platforms that everybody uses every day, we saw a lot happen in 2020, right? Feels like it was the year of misinformation. And with misinformation, obviously comes mistrust. And one of the things you said to me when we first spoke, Steve, was that trust is the foundation of business, obviously, and identity is the cornerstone of trust, knowing who someone is. And that I need to trust, say, a financial services provider with my data, with my money. They need to trust me that I am who I say I am. We talked about this as being kind of bi-directional trust. How do you think that this year of misinformation has impacted how individuals and financial services providers specifically build trust with each other?
Well, that's a really big topic. I think that, and it's interesting because I think that some of the challenges we've seen in 2020, there are some technology driven challenges like deep fakes and fake accounts and bots and all of those things. But then there's also just more of a social push towards maybe much more belief in conspiracy theories and just that social discourse on what's true and what's not true. So I think 2020 and what's going on right now is interesting. And then when you play that out in a digital channel, right, given that I'm now needing to consume more and more digital services because of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing, I might be forced into interacting digitally with a service provider that I previously didn't, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to deposit a check with my banking app for the very first time instead of driving into the branch. Or maybe I'm going to ask somebody to deliver groceries to my home. Each of these are very personal things. And I think that especially for people who maybe weren't familiar with it prior to the pandemic, kind of being forced into it, it's almost an unfair situation, right? But then on top of that, you have everything going on in the news with some of the mistrust of the big tech companies, which is really interesting at the very time you need to take advantage of more digital services. So I think, definitely a challenging year. And I think that given where Mitek is and the services we provide to our customers, we've definitely seen some companies thrive in this environment, and we've seen some have some struggles. And I think it does boil down to how you're interacting with your customer and what you're doing specifically as a business to create that safe environment to build trust.
Yeah, I'm with you. And that's a good point about depositing checks because in my neck of the woods here in Ireland, that's so rare. And the last time I actually had to deposit a check, it was one that I got from the US Treasury called a stimulus check, right? That I got last year. And I took a picture of that check with one of my financial accounts in the US that I still have open and their app, and boom, it was gone. It was in, it was available right away. My level of trust for that financial provider that they were just going to be able to take that and be able to process it for me, and that financial services provider had trust in me that I was actually depositing a real check. That is a very complicated relationship between an institution and individual that needs to work every single time for fraud not to result from it. I'm continually fascinated by this element of the two-way trust. We think a lot about how an individual trusts an institution, but also it's the other way about how an institution can trust an individual, right? Have you thought about that at all in terms of how a financial services player builds that trust with their own customer,
Yeah, I think about it every day. I mean, it's really, really at the core of what Mitek does. And I think oftentimes when I'm working with our financial services customers and partners, a topic that comes up a lot is friction, right? So when you're signing up for a service, maybe you want to sign up to a neobank or a new digital service offered by your existing bank, and you have to go through that sign up process, right? A lot of thought goes into every single step of that process. And there's a trade off between friction or convenience and security or risk. And typically, if you want to increase security in that workflow, you're almost certainly also going to increase friction. Right. And whenever you increase friction, that creates an opportunity for that new user to abandon the workflow and to drop out. And that's really the core thing that most banks are designing for and financial service providers are designing for, is to get as many good customers through that flow as possible. So whenever you're proposing a technology that's going to increase security, you always have to be conscious about what type of friction you're adding. So we spend a lot of time making sure that, Mitek's part of that onboarding flow is as frictionless as possible. Right? You're going to have to get an identity document out of your wallet or out of your purse, and you're going to have to take a picture of it. But we're going to make that as easy as possible, right? And we're going to hopefully make it enjoyable. It's going to be quick. It's going to be seamless. Very similar to when you deposited your check. You were probably surprised. Wow, that picture, it took the picture really fast the very first time. And next thing you know, it's in my account. Same thing for the identity verification. You want it to be that seamless, almost magical experience, right? And what we've seen is when our customers do a really good job of that, they actually turn that potentially negative friction into a positive aspect. Not only as a neat, magical, technology-heavy kind of experience that people enjoy, but they also recognize that you're going to the next level to protect their identity. Right? Identity verification sounds so punitive in some cases, right? Like, we're going to make sure you are who you say you are. But really, the other side of that coin is identity protection. Right? So if I'm showing enough respect for your identity, that I'm going to, make sure that you are who you say you are before I give you a loan, for example, then that should be perceived by you as a net benefit.
Yeah, it does. And thinking about the experience of when I wanted to up my levels, my trading levels, right, within a financial services app, and they wanted to reconfirm or at least take the next step in terms of confirming me to a higher degree, right? I actually, because I'm a bit of a fintech geek, I actually enjoyed that experience, right? And like you said, the check deposit, I enjoyed that as well. All that was very easy. And it did make me feel, it did actually increase my level of trust in the institution themselves, right? How does that actually play out when it is someone that is less digitally savvy, right? And trying to fit those parts of the user journey that Mitek can influence and control when you're inserting your identity technology into the overall user journey, managing that with these different types of levels of digital savviness across your client's customer base. That thing must be a bit of mental gymnastics to get.
It is. Fortunately, though, if we go all the way back to the days when Mitek kind of invented and released mobile deposit. So I don't know if you knew this, but when you were using mobile deposit with your US bank, it was almost certainly a Mitek technology under the hood.
Okay.
That act of taking a picture of a check and having enough quality in that image so that the back end processes the check correctly, filters out the fraud, and gives all the right information back to the bank, and everyone ends up happy. The quality of that picture is everything. And it turns out it's not very easy for end users to take good pictures of checks, let alone identity documents, right? And you have to remember that many people are doing this for the first time. And in the case of identity documents, it might be the only time they ever take a picture of their identity document. They're certainly not experts in that. So Mitek invested heavily in building a capture software development kit that we give to our customers. So actually, when you're going through that experience in your banking app, you're actually using the Mitek software, right? Because, from a bit of a technical perspective, right, our back end is a computer vision pipeline, right? Images in, data out. And the quality of that image is, like I said, everything. Garbage in, garbage out. So we need to ensure that image is very good quality to make sure that we return good results, which means that you really can't invest too much time, right, in making sure that experience is as frictionless as possible. And one of the big inventions that came along was when we moved, for example, from asking you to take a picture of the check, and there was actually a button you had to press on your app, right, to take the picture.
Yep.
Moving from that to saying, well, instead of doing that, we're just going to monitor a video stream, and our science is going to run on every frame of the video, and we're going to pick the good image.
Wow.
You just have to hold it over the check. That resulted in a net 20 to 25 percentage points of acceptance rate increase, right? Simply because when you think about it, I'm holding a check with one hand, I'm holding my device with the other hand, I got to move my finger over to the button to hit the capture. Things that seem obvious now, but back then were pretty innovative. And of course, we've carried that forward to the identity experiences, et cetera, right? But again, that's just a little bit of
Yeah, that's
vignette
so cool.
on you can't focus too much time on the usability. It's really everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about identity and photos and people's faces, right, as being a higher power beyond documents, obviously, that we've all seen the Tom Cruise playing golf deepfake, right? And that was pretty good. And I think I saw one on Elon Musk the other day as well. I said that to someone earlier today, and they were like, yeah, but Elon Musk's face just looks like a deepfake all the time anyway. Right? So
And his speech pattern too. That's right. Yeah.
exactly. And so how do you prevent that? Dealing with biometrics now, right? How do you prevent the deep fake from getting through the net?
Yeah. So first off, I think deep fakes are a significant threat. And even though they're getting a lot of press now, I still believe that it's just the tip of the iceberg with the difficulties we're all going to have in the digital, on the internet more broadly, because of deep fakes. On one side, it's just what content can you trust? And you can imagine, right? All it takes is one world leader in a deepfake video saying or doing something that causes people to react. And with our social media reality, and all it takes is one social media post with that deep fake augmented by some bots, or amplified, I should say, by some bots, and the damage is done, right? But on the other side, I think what you were talking about more directly is, what are the risks to identity and to security based on deep fakes and biometrics? Deep fakes certainly are an attack vector to spoofing biometric systems, right? Imagine a face biometric system. If you're signing into your banking app using your face, there's creating the biometric of the face and comparing it to a stored biometric is a relatively straightforward process. Now, the experts out there are going to say there's a lot of detail and nuance in how you do that, but in general, that's a fairly commoditized solved problem. What's really hard is the anti-spoofing. So what are the protections you're putting around the system to make sure that it's not some kind of an attack? And one of the more powerful mechanisms in the identity space is a liveness check. So you need to make sure that if someone's presenting a face to your system, it's got to be a live original face, not a recording of a face. And when you think about how an attacker would present a deep fake to a biometric system, they'd essentially have to hold their phone up to a screen.
Yeah.
Correct? Right?
Yeah.
That's how the bad guy would do it. This is why it's so important to really understand how the bad guys do what they do. So then if you're good at detecting images coming from screens, then that's a very effective way to defend against deepfakes. So we at Mitek, we spend a lot of time both in our own research environments and also with technology partners that we work with to make sure that not only are we building defenses against deepfakes, but we're building up a test environment where we ourselves can attack our own systems with deepfake technology to make sure we know how well it's behaving. But as I mentioned in my intro, I've spent a lot of time in the cybersecurity world. And so this is a part of business that I am just very used to. It's a never-ending arms race where the attackers are getting more sophisticated and the defenders need to keep upping their game as well.
Yeah. Think like a hacker, right?
Exactly, right? To catch a crook, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one of the guys here in Dublin, Stefan Euger, runs a business called For Securitas, and we had him on the show back a couple of years ago, and he would talk about, he is a reformed hacker himself, so he knows all the tricks, but I guess he's been out of the game of hacking for a while, so there's plenty more tricks that the full-time hackers have figured out that well beyond his skill set now. I hadn't yet thought about this interaction between cybersecurity and biometrics, right? And naturally, obviously, the two go hand in hand. But when you're thinking about how you actually process all of this data that you're capturing. Is there an intersection between the threat defense mechanisms and the biometrics and how all that data is analyzed within the business?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And what we're seeing is, I think we're seeing some of these security concepts that are prevalent in the enterprise, meaning how am I securing my enterprise infrastructure and how am I monitoring and authenticating my employees? That is starting to find a place over on the consumer side where it's how do I now protect my services and authenticate
Uh,
and monitor the activity of my consumers. And in fact, in the identity and access management market, there's a distinction between workforce IAM and consumer IAM. And consumer IAM is getting very popular. And in fact, Mitek is getting involved in quite a bit of it. And there's another enterprise or primarily enterprise concept called zero trust, right? Which essentially means that you should trust nobody on your enterprise network. You should monitor all behavior and you should be continually comparing whether or not that user on your network is still behaving and acting like the user you expect them to be.
mhm.
Right? Are they accessing the files they normally access or using the networks they normally use, the other services they normally use? So that idea of zero trust, of something happening in the background, right? I think there's a very large opportunity for that to also provide benefit on the consumer side. And this is really to me where biometrics come into it, right? If you're interacting with an app and you're logging in using your face, then behind the scenes, all of that biometric data should be compared and monitored to who we expect that person to be, right?
Yeah.
And there are emerging user interfaces like a more of a conversational user interface where think about how you work with the smart devices in your home, right?
Mhm.
You're talking to them, right? And those devices are continually listening to you.
Oh, yeah.
So and it's not just for authentication, meaning, say a password or a passphrase or something along those lines. It's also for identity, right? And there's very real uses for that. Let's say you're a family in a home and you have children and parents, right? Well, maybe your TV should be able to differentiate between the parents and the children and provide the appropriate, programming guide for adults versus children, right? So they're identifying you by your voice and they're also authenticating you with your voice. And the opportunity for biometrics in this case is that that's all kind of happening in the background, right? It's from the perspective of the user, the consumer, it's passive. I didn't have to do anything special. It's just happening. Now, of course, this brings up a lot of questions about trust and safety and data privacy
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. But conceptually, I think that's where the consumer security world can start learning a lot from what we've been doing on the enterprise side.
Absolutely, absolutely. And time to time over the years, I've talked about how usually when there are innovations that are brought into the financial markets, more or less, it comes generally from the institutional enterprise level first, and then comes down to the consumer level. But
Mm.
what's happened is that with smartphones in the palm of all of our hands, these individual financial services innovations are now moving upstream to the
Mhm.
institutional side, right? But this is really interesting what you're sharing here because you're talking about it now coming back, right?
Yeah.
We have had to go to such the nth degree on the institutional side, on the enterprise side, with digital, with security, with biometrics, that now we're bringing that back to the consumer side, which is that's mind blowing.
Yeah.
This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by Pat FinTech, demystifying fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. Pat FinTech enable financial services professionals to transform their capabilities into the digital age with dedicated virtual training programs geared towards those that can develop, deliver, and monitor optimally customized user experiences balanced by appropriate governance, control, and oversight. To learn more about Pat FinTech, go to moneyneversleeps.ie/PAT-FinTech.
Money never sleeps, pal.
When you're talking about all of the biometric data that you're capturing, the photographs, the videos, that is a huge amount of data, right? And a lot of data to store, but a lot of data to potentially mine and to use. right? And when you have that much data, then you start thinking about things such as neural networks, machine learning, right? How does all of that then play into this? I know you talked about how when you're establishing someone's identity, that you're going to have a pattern of what you expect them to look like and what you expect their behavior to be online. But when you're thinking about learning systems versus rule-based systems, how does that all play out?
Well, that's a great question. So, first of all, the difference between learning and rule-based systems. Fortunately, I think back around, I'd say around 2011, 2012 is really when we started the most current kind of renaissance for machine learning. And a lot of people attribute that to this confluence of the availability of relatively cheap compute in the cloud, technologies around big data to manage large amounts of data, and then just advances in machine learning architectures, specifically the advent of deep learning. And these three things kind of coming together at just the right time opens up a lot of new opportunity for machine learning. But why would you even use machine learning over maybe more classical forms of software development? Well, so the nice thing about deep neural networks is they have the ability to discover the features or the rules on their own, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to having a subject matter expert, either an engineer or a scientist, sit down and code all the rules or just inventory all the rules in the first place, right? So I think machine learning allows us to do a lot more with the data we have, and then when we get access to a lot more data, those two things just feed on themselves, and that's where we get to these solutions that are, just from an accuracy perspective, are really breathtaking. And we've gotten to a point now where the differentiation between two different solutions mostly comes down to the data that you had available to you to train them with in the first place.
Right.
So it kind of has created a bit of a race to get the right data. Right. A challenge, of course, is when you're trying to provide an identity protection solution using machine learning that needs a lot of data, and the data itself is very sensitive. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's personally identifiable information. It's pictures of people's faces, maybe prints of their voice, images of their identity documents, very, very sensitive information that happens to be heavily regulated around the world. So you have to be very careful. And the other thing, and I kind of mentioned this earlier about, technology's promise and capability to provide so much benefit to us. But at the same time, if it's not done right, it can be a big negative. And one of the things we're seeing in this kind of confluence of biometrics and machine learning is, how do you ensure that your solution isn't biased against a given class of individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
So pick a biometric, any biometric, whether it's age or ethnicity or gender, any one of those. If your data set is not balanced correctly to adequately represent all those different permutations, then, for example, you may end up with a face comparison algorithm that does really good for white males between the age of 25 and 40,
Yeah.
but does terribly for women of color, right? And the net result of that is, and this would be a terrible outcome, would be that certain classes of individual may not have the same access to digital services as other people.
Yeah.
And increasingly, as these digital services become almost inalienable rights, right? You have to have access to these to have opportunity in this world. Ensuring that everybody has equal access and aren't discriminated to based on any one of those biometric traits is really important. So it's something at Mitek we spend a lot of time on. We work a lot with our technology partners. And I think what you're seeing out there in the world, you even see some really large face data sets, for example, being pulled off of the internet by the university or the research organization that had created it because there was bias in the data set. The
Yeah.
technology is not biased. It's like anything else. If you learn from a biased set of data, then the result will be biased.
Yeah. It's like education, right? And it's human education as well as machine education, right? You just need
The parallels are real there.
all these different experiences, all these different, and I think you said, looking at lines rather than dots, right?
Exactly.
I was listening to an interesting podcast this morning. I think it was Invest Like the Best with Patrick O'Shaughnessy. And he had Josh Buckley on from Product Hunt. And what he was talking about was that so many of the innovations that have happened over the last 30 to 40 years have been in the digital space, not the physical space. It's like if you take all of the screens and devices out of this room, it'll pretty much look the same as it did in the 1970s, right? We haven't seen that many innovations, and that the physical world hasn't kept pace with the innovations in the digital world. And that is a trend that's going to continue. I thought we'd see flying cars by now, right? But I think we're still a little bit ways away from that. If you think about some of the longer term impacts of the shift to digital, right? The world's become so dependent on being able to open a financial account, open any type of service account on a fully 100% digital experience. What happens if we get that wrong, right? You mentioned, the perhaps mistraining of the algorithm based upon a limited sample size. But, where can this all go horribly wrong?
Well, if I'm trying to think of the dystopian future, I think it's
let's go in the dark direction for a minute.
yeah. But I think it's important, right? Because like I said earlier, there's two sides to every coin, right? And understanding what could go wrong can help influence how you deliver your solution today so that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. Like I said, digital services, it creates an environment. And I think everyone's aware of the fact that it's also creates a bit of a digital divide, right? It's a new modern idea of the haves and the have-nots, right?
Yep.
Do you have a mobile device? Do you have good access to the internet? Do you have the ability to prove your identity remotely? Right there's quite a large problem where over 1 billion people in the world today can't actually prove their identity, because they don't have a government issued identity document, or they don't have a history or what have you, right? And if they can't prove their identity, then they're not even being allowed into these digital services, right?
Yeah.
So I think the dystopian future is that, digital services become more important and fewer people get access to them. To me, that's the worst possible outcome. But on the other side of that coin, we also have the opportunity to say, well, digital services could also be the thing that brings people in, that creates the inclusion. Right? We saw this happen, something similar. It's going to sound a little bit like a non sequitur, but something similar when cellular phone technology hit the world. Right? You had parts of the world that didn't have the infrastructure for telephone poles and wires, and they probably were never going to get to the point where they could go deploy infrastructure like that.
Yeah.
Right? So people didn't have access to that form of communication. Then cellular technology comes out, and it's we can just put towers up. And what we saw is some of those lesser developed parts of the world actually jumped forward ahead of the developed part of the world, because they went immediately to the new technology, right? And maybe you see something similar with SpaceX's Starlink service, where now you can get very, very good broadband quality internet pretty much anywhere in the world, even the poles, for a relatively reasonable amount of money, right? Now, if we go the next step and make sure that disadvantaged rural parts of the world, parts of our world, right, have some form of subsidy, now we've made this digital infrastructure available to everybody. And on top of that, we can build incredibly inclusive solutions. That's the type of thing that keeps me going.
Yeah, it does for me too. That's why I'm just so fascinated about the fintech innovations that we're seeing in less developed countries, right? Where, like you said, people just saying, well, it's available. We've got connectivity. Let's build it. And let's provide a micro lending platform, for example, that can make a difference with the ability to lend someone effectively the equivalent of $10 a day. When we all return back to the shopping malls, I'm not sure I will, right? I was never a big fan of them. Get in, get what you need to, get out. But there's another group of individuals in my household that would take a different opinion on that. All this work that we've done, right, to be able to transact digitally. When people are vaccinated, people are going to start going back to the shops. But how do you think this is all going to play out? Right? And what are the parts of that digital experience that will carry over into the bricks and mortar experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, what the last year has done, I think it's given a lot of people, it's given some people the opportunity to use digital services for the first time, right? They may have never used them. So it kind of forced consumers out there to get some experience with it. But I think for me, at least, maybe a little personally, it helps me really understand the benefits of what and how I do things online versus what I really want to be able to do when I go to a store in person, right? And those are slightly different things, right? And in my own kind of shopping habits, I use the online services to compare and contrast, do endless research on anything I buy. But for some items, I still prefer to go and pick them up. right?
Yeah.
And I like that physical experience. And I think that the companies that figure out how to provide that right balance at the right time are going to be, the winners out of this whole thing. And I think over the last year, consumers out there have had a lot of time to think about who they're doing business with and why they prefer one service over another. And I'm excited to get back to physical life as well, not just, on the shopping side, but on the business side. But I think much like in the business life of what's work going to be like after the pandemic, I think on the retail side, it's going to be a mix, right? It's not going to go all the way back to the way it was. I think it's going to be a really interesting mix of things, new habits we developed during the last year, and a recognition of what we enjoyed about the physical experience from the past.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one fintech startup here in Dublin called Optimize, and they basically hit the market at the beginning of the pandemic. And it basically enables those that are using the Square app or the SumUp type app in a retail shop to be able to have complete inventory control, invoicing, all that type of stuff, all uniquely integrated. And
Wow.
what the founder of the business, David, said was that, listen, when the pandemic hit, people would have thought we would have gone right out of business because retail's closed. But you know what? We started integrating that into everybody converting to Shopify, right? And it's just adjusting like that, those innovations that hopefully make the world go around. But no, lots of massive lessons learned in business, like you said, overall coming out of the last year. It's just been impressive. These podcasts, for example, we used to record in a WeWork in the center of Dublin, and we haven't done that in well over a year, right? And if it weren't, for what's happened over the last year, you and I probably wouldn't be talking right now, right? Just because of the confluence of events that occurred when I was introduced to your colleagues in London. Shout out to Von Owen, great guy, and Lloyd Reeve as well. So, but listen, a number of topics that you've brought to us tonight, Steve, that will take me into a bit of mental gymnastics to really go down the rabbit hole on, and I will have a look at Lex Friedman. But the way we like to end this podcast all the time is asking folks, what is one thing that people wouldn't expect to know about you?
One thing that people wouldn't expect to know about me. Well, I really enjoy working on cars. I've got an old 1972 Ford Bronco, and I've been refurbishing that thing for the last 15 years. And when I've got some spare time, I enjoy getting the wrenches out, getting in the garage, and working on that car. And it's a bit of a contrast because I'm a pretty environmentally friendly person. It's not a very environmentally friendly car. Thankfully, my daily driver is a battery electric vehicle, and the Bronco doesn't get on the road too often. And maybe at some point I'll find a way to convert it over to electric. But for me, there's just nothing better than turning a wrench when you got the time.
That's awesome. How long would you spend on it, like on a weekend?
Depends on what I'm doing. Maybe a couple hours if it's just something minor, all the way up to a couple days if I'm doing a significant, like swapping out an engine or something like that.
Nice. Yeah, I had this neighbor growing up. He restored a 1960 Corvette, right? He was my next door neighbor. I remember the day that it was dropped off on a flatbed truck in front of his house. I don't think I helped. My dad might have helped, but pushed that into the garage, right? And then he just worked on it. And then one day we saw him driving out with one of his kids sitting there, rag top down, so absolutely props to that. That is not an easy task. How much longer do you think you have before you can get it out in the streets?
Oh, it drives. It's kind of a weekend beach car at the moment. But, with an old car, there's always something to do. There's always something you got to work on. The next big project is going to be a paint job. But other than that, like I said, I would really love to convert it over to an electric car. And, we're just starting to see now, thankfully, because the electric car industry in general is doing so well now, that a lot of the kind of traditional car modification shops now are starting to get into the electric market as well, and providing kits to convert your car, from a gas car to a battery car. And they're still quite expensive, but I guess like everything, with more volume, those prices should come down, and that would be neat.
Yeah, it would. And I would say that you could probably keep the sanctity of the 1972 Ford Bronco with an electric engine. Just don't put wings on it and make it a flying Bronco.
I won't do that.
Good man. All right. Well, Steve, listen, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about all this tonight. Learned a lot, and I'm going to take away a lot from this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That does it for this week, folks. Thanks to Steve for opening up his mind to help us figure out why he does what he does. Links are on our website at moneyneversleeps.ie to get in touch with the folks at Mitek and learn more about why they're trusted the world over for digital identity verification. And you can find Mitek online at miteksystems.com. Also, thanks to Conan Brophy from Create Sound for mixing and editing this episode. Conan is an excellent media man to get in touch with when you're thinking about launching your own podcast. As for me, I'm the founding partner at Norio Ventures, and I'm an early-stage startup advisor and investor focused on fintech and digital assets. If you'd like to talk to me about your business, get in touch at pete@norioventures.com. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.